God has crumbled. This morning I'd like to take you to Psalm 129, 130, and 131. Psalm 129 starts, "Many times they have persecuted me from my youth up. Let Israel now say, many times they have persecuted me from my youth up, yet they have not prevailed against me. The plowers plowed upon my back, they lengthened their furrows. The Lord is righteous, he has cut the two cords of the wicked. May all who hate Zion be put to shame and turned backward. Let them be like grass upon the housetops, which withers before it grows up, with which the reaper does not fill his hand, or the binder sheaves his bosom. Nor do those who pass by say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you. We bless you in the name of the Lord. Out of the depths I have cried to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul does wait, and in his word do I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than the watchman in the morning, indeed more than the watchman for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is loving kindness, and with him is abundant redemption, and he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor my eyes haughty, nor do I involve myself in great matters or things too difficult for me. Surely I have composed and quieted my soul. Like a weaned child rests against his mother, my soul is like a weaned child within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forever." I bring you to these three Psalms this morning, and we will look at them in collection with each other, but this is the next triad that we have in this grouping of Psalms referred to as the Songs of Ascent. And the next three go together, but they are very distinct from the others in the sense that the first one is the first one that indicates Zion. The others two do not focus so much on Zion as the first psalm does, and that breaks from the pattern that is typical that is run through here. When we've had groupings of three, the third one has always been that one that's focused on Zion, but here we find it referenced in the very first one in Psalm 129, verse 5. This sets it off as being unique, and so this got me started to think that I needed to look at these as a whole, just as I looked at the last three as a whole, and all of a sudden things start falling into place and you start to notice the progression. But earlier we've seen in earlier Psalms in this collection, we've seen from 121 to 124 that there were opposition that was dealt with. It was external, it was circumstantial, it was human. But all of a sudden when we get to Psalm 130 and 131, all of a sudden it moves towards the internal. It becomes very personal. And it's awesome because what it does is it reminds us that the struggles that we have, the contentions that we have, the journey that we're on isn't merely just a physical one, it's a spiritual one. And oftentimes the things that then threaten us aren't the things that are outside of us, they're oftentimes the things that are within us. Oftentimes the greatest threat to our journey is us and the reality of our sinfulness. In Psalm 129, there is thanks given to the righteous Lord, and it's awesome because it is affirmed the fact that He is righteous, not that He merely acts in righteousness, but this is who He is, verse 4. And so the appeal is made, and Israel is going to be saved, as we see in this first Psalm, and the ungodly foes are going to be left in His hand, but all of a sudden a theme is struck, the righteousness of God. And here what's interesting as you transition from Psalm 129 to 130 is the sense of the fact that here we have the righteousness of God being appealed to. Israel appeals to God's righteousness that He would judge the foes and those in opposition towards Zion and towards His people. And so they appeal to God to act upon His righteousness, that standard of holiness by which He acts. And then when you call that into action, all of a sudden now you have to realize that now my life is brought in contact with that. So I ask this question, is not this same righteousness a threat also to Israel? You see, I think about this in regards to America, and I think about the sinfulness of this land and the plague that is here of sin, and I want God's righteousness to be manifested, but if I'm going to call it forth, I have to realize that that same standard then is going to weigh my life. And am I ready for that? And that is the transition from 129 to 130. Because the reality of 130 verse 3 says this, for no sinner can stand before the Lord. So isn't that when the Lord teaches us and we're dealing with sin in the life of a brother? Before you remove the speck in your brother's eye, remove the log from your own. I call down the righteousness of God upon this land, but I have to be careful that when I call down the righteousness of God upon this land, that same standard of measure, my life is measured by. And I love that fact about God, is the standard is the same for everybody. He is an impartial God. And the great thing is that He functions according to that standard. Because it flows from His very nature, His holiness. But if we're going to call forth the righteousness of God upon the land and upon all opposition, we need to be ready that we are going to face it with our own life. But here's the great truth. Our God is a God who forgives. And our God is a God of love. And our God is a God of redemption. This is one of Luther's favorite psalms, and he refers to them as the Pauline Psalms. And this is one of them. Why? Verse 4. But there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. This but in verse 4 of Psalm 130 is equal to the but in verse 4 of Ephesians chapter 2. We were dead in our trespasses and sins, and on he goes to talk about our sinful state, and all of a sudden verse 4, but God being rich in mercy. One of the great transitions. Luther loved this song, and it is becoming one of my favorites as well. But it's interesting because we move from this psalm to Psalm 130, where we find a heart at rest and at hope in the Lord. And it's whether in forgiveness or in life generally, that is the great truth that comes in Psalm 131. And I've often looked at this one, and when I look at it in light of its overall context in relation to the other two, it's so much more staggering to me, that sense of contentment and peace that the psalmist finds in this regards David, that he finds just resting and hoping in his God. And he wants to stay there forever. So the movement of the songs basically goes like this. It starts with righteousness, it moves to forgiveness, and then finally to rest. And that is our overall outline as we walk through these three psalms together and look at these movements in this psalter and in this triad. But we're all moving towards that final rest, and we can experience it now. But it's just interesting when you meditate on Psalm 131. We're not going to get into the details of it. I'll just touch on it this morning, but I challenge you to go back and look at it. But this is a state of existence I always want to be in. Surely I have composed and quieted my soul like a weaned child rests against his mother. My soul is like a weaned child within me. His ultimate aim, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forever. It's just where I want to be. I just want to rest in my God and look forward to that final ultimate rest that we all have. So let's begin the journey starting with the issue of God's righteousness. This psalm is made up of two parts, verses 1 through 4 and 5 through 8. And we have dealt with here the past deliverances and then the present and future deliverances, verses 5 through 8. And this is a great structure, and it's very telling. It helps instruct us as to how the flow goes, and some of the truth that is here is so crucial for us when we look at our life, and as we know that we have journeys still ahead of us. But notice the alteration that happens. We begin with conflict in the first couple verses, then we have deliverance in the end of verse 2. Then we have conflict again, verse 3, and then we have deliverance, verse 4. The alternation back and forth, and it begins with this emphatic statement in regards to many times they have persecuted me. Verse 2, many times they have persecuted me. Some translations, they have greatly. And this is the same term that is used. Actually, in Psalm 123, we've had this term used twice in verse 3 and verse 4, where the psalmist refers to greatly filled. Here, as the psalmist looks to the history past, he sees that it was filled with distresses and conflict. And we have seen similar phrases and terms that occur in this psalm that have occurred in Psalm 123, 124. But there is differences in the sense of the opposition that is faced. In Psalm 124, the opposition is likened to floods of water and to a hunter. But here, it's likened to a farmer who plows a field with long furrows, reflecting the deep wounds that are brought about by the opposition and by the foes. So the psalmist, on behalf of Israel, and he's going to call upon Israel to look back in their history past. Notice verse 1. Had it not, verse 1 and verse 129, many times they have persecuted me from my youth up. Let Israel now say, many times they have persecuted me from my youth up. He calls upon the nation collectively as they look upon their history and see what has happened. And this double reference to from my youth up is likely looking all the way back to Exodus and the land of Egypt, when they from there, as they were delivered from Egypt, they now became a nation. That was their beginning, their youth. And they grew and they developed as a nation, but throughout their history, over and over, they saw that there was in their back trail, their journey as a nation, there was persecution over and over, but at the same time, there were tokens of God's mercy. So as the psalmist looks back and he challenges other in the nation of Israel to look back, you see there is a record of conflict, but there's also a record of victory and deliverance. It's the same for all of us. I have walked with the Lord for some time now, 7 years old when I came to Christ. And by God's grace, I have served Him more years than I have walked in rebellion against Him. But from all those years, from age 7 to 48, right? From age 7 to 48, I have seen God over and over in times of conflict bring deliverance. That is not only the history of the nation of Israel, that is our history. That is our salvation history. And so the psalmist is going to look back, but this is awesome because we realize that it is those facts of the past in verses 1 through 4 that he looks upon that gives him hope for the present and for the future. There is no doubt that those who want to walk in relationship with God and in harmony with His will, they're going to face opposition over and over and over throughout life. The history tells it, so we know our future holds it. But here's the truth. Just as much as God delivered in the past, He will deliver you in the future. And this is the hope. And this is the challenge, I would say, to all of us, especially as we look at this psalm, to remember your past. Don't live in the past, because oftentimes we like to do that. We like to look over our shoulder to the glory days. We think they were glory days, but the glory days are ahead of us, not behind us. But we look in the past. We tend to want to live in the past, even in our past victories and experiences and the things that we've done for the Lord in the faith. And we look backwards, but we can't run forward if we keep looking back. But at the same time, it is good at times to be reminded of the fact of what God has done for us. Don't live there, but be reminded by it. And as we face future problems, we can remember and reflect on the fact that God has delivered us already so many times. So many times. There was a couple in the church down in Southern California, a younger couple, and they over the years had compiled a scrapbook of all the times that God had delivered them out of difficulty. And every once in a while they would sit down as a couple and they would open the scrapbook up and they would sit back and they would recount the different ways that God had delivered them. And this is what the psalmist draws on, and this is what we are to rest upon as we look to the past. And with all the manifold threats that come, the lesson from history is a simple one, and that is the fact that no matter how savage the opposition is, no matter how brutal they are, no matter how deep those furrows they may dig into us, they can never gain the upper hand because God is righteous. And God will bring His righteous judgment. And that is what the psalmist hopes for and draws upon. God has revealed Himself as being a redeemer to His people. He is the one who conquers His foes, and He never deviates from this standard. This standard is rooted in Him. That's the beauty of the righteousness of God. The righteousness of God is the holiness of God applied to His relationship with His beings. There is a standard that is established by His very nature, and that's the great thing about God. The standard by which God operates isn't a standard that is outside of Him. It's not a standard by someone who is above God or beyond God. It is a standard that resides within His very nature and being of holiness, and it is that standard by which He operates and He judges. And it is that standard that the psalmist looks upon and knows. Verse 4, the Lord, He is righteous. He is cut into the cords of the wicked. The interesting thing about this fact is that those who are in opposition towards the Lord and towards His people, what they seek is bondage. The Lord brings freedom. The Lord is the one who sets us free, and over throughout Israel's history, over and over, we find that there were many who tried to enslave them, whether the Egyptians, the Philistines, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, over and over. The opposition was there over and over. The enslavement was there. So in light of this deliverance by the Lord, the righteous one comes. He faces the future, and he moves in verses 5 through 8 as he appeals to God, this righteous Lord, and he appeals to Him to deal with those who are in opposition. And the verbs that are used in verses 5 through 8, they can be looked upon as prophecy or prayer. If prayer, this is how to deal with life. If prophecy, this is how you face the future. Either way, there's confidence here. And the confidence is based on the Lord's past actions. I can be confident just as surely as the Lord has acted in the past, I know He will act in the future. God does not deviate from that righteous standard. He cannot. He will not. I was talking about with the kids the other day, the things that God cannot do. And oftentimes we fail to think about God in that way. There are things God cannot do. He cannot violate His nature. God cannot lie. Cannot lie. That's awesome, because that means everything that God says is truth. If He says this is how the universe came to being, that's how it came to be. If He says this is how you have a blessed life, this is how you have a blessed life. If this is how I say your life ought to be, then this is the way your life ought to be. And if I say this is the outcome of that life, then this is the outcome of that life. God cannot lie. God is always faithful, and God is always, always righteous. Always, no matter what He does. So 3 things the psalmist calls for in regards to the wicked. Let them all be put to shame and turn back that hate Zion. Just think about this for a moment. He is pronouncing judgment in his prayer upon the enemies of God. Just stop and think about this for a moment. Well, wait a minute. Hate the sin, love the sinner. Just think about it. Notice the next pronouncement. Let them be as grass upon the housetops. In other words, let them wither and fade away. Let them produce nothing. Let not the blessing of the Lord be pronounced over them. This is tough to swallow. Psalm 139. I'll read it to you. You don't have to turn there. Just listen to the words of David. Oh, that you should slay the wicked, O God. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. You see, sometimes we tend to compartmentalize God into one attribute, love. God is absolutely love. Absolutely. But God is also holy and righteous. When was the last time we were zealous for the holiness of God? When were the last time that we prayed down God's judgment upon sinful mankind? Those who hate God and who rebel against God, who are dogmatic about their resistance towards God. How many times have we ever prayed that? The amazing thing about the psalmist's prayer here is, may all who hate Zion be put to shame and turn backward. This is not a prayer of pettiness. This is a prayer for the glory of God. This is someone who is concerned with God's glory and that He is exalted and that His name be praised for what it is, that He is holy and righteous. And so therefore the psalmist is not looking out for his own vindication. He is looking out for the vindication of God. He is concerned about God's kingdom, not man's kingdom, and not his own individual kingdom. The enemies who hate Zion are those who have no regard for God or His promises. And Zion here denotes the presence of God among His people. It is His covenant blessing, His hope, and the victorious establishment of His kingdom. They are opposed to everything about God and what He is doing. And the psalmist says, I pray you deal with them. May in your righteousness and in your righteous standard, may you judge them accordingly. The interesting thing about the enemies of Zion, the wicked in verse 4, aren't just merely those who are on the outside, it's also Israelites. We find this reflected in 125, but also in 129 verse 8. Nor do those who pass by say, the blessing of the Lord be upon you. We bless you in the name of the Lord. We realize that even when in regards to the church, there are the wheat and then there are the tares. Even in our midst, there are those who are opposed to God. They look like wheat, they talk like wheat, they act like wheat. They're not wheat. And one day God is going to winnow them out. And it is all right to pray that God winnows His church and He sifts them out. But then comes Psalm 130, I hope that I'm not one of them. And I better be sure that I'm not. He prays in verse 6, the wicked may they wither like grass on the roof, growing in a shallow dirt. The plants soon withered when they are deprived of moisture. Verse 7, the grass may grow, but it is useless that the reaper not cut them down or bind them in sheaves. In other words, we're talking about a wasted growth, and so it is with all the wicked. There is a semblance of sproutage that happens, but in the end, it's just vain. We've seen that already, right? It is vain to build without the Lord. Those who hate Zion will prove to be transient, unsuccessful, unbefriended, and excluded from the community of blessing. This is a powerful way to end this psalm, but this is a great one because the transition comes. But yes, guess what? Our God is a God who forgives. Psalm 130 is the psalm of forgiveness. There's 4 parts to this. The first is a cry of the soul for mercy, verses 1 through 2. There is the confession of sin and forgiveness, verses 3 through 4. There's a waiting of the soul for the Lord, verses 5 through 6, and then confidence in redemption, verses 7 through 8. This is where we'll spend the most of our time now this morning. And I pray that we don't miss the truths that are here. Because as we call down the righteousness of God, we have to realize that that same righteousness then is applicable to our life. And that same standard our lives will be judged by. And that is what sets this triad off from all the others. This is the first time we have mention of righteousness in regards to the Lord. And it sets the stage for the next 2. It is true that if the righteousness of God sides with His people, then no foe can prosper, Psalm 129. But if this God is among His people and He sides with them, will not His righteous presence expose and condemn their sin? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. You see, this is the fear, right, we might have in calling forth the righteousness of God to come upon this land, is that our life is going to be judged by that same exact righteousness, and we will be exposed for who we are. I mean, this is the reality of it, right? When we judge ourselves by our standard, we always are successful. It's easy to live up to my standard I set for myself. I'm never going to set the bar very high. Right? I will always succeed. I will always be victorious if I live by the standard of Steve. But if I live by the standard of God, I fail over and over and over and over. And that's where forgiveness comes. And the words of this psalm tell the story. There is a progression. It moves from depths to mercy, to forgiveness, to waiting, to hope. Isn't that awesome? That is so awesome. I love that we're not hanging in the depths. I love that we're not left with Psalm 129. I love that it's followed by Psalm 130. And more importantly, it's followed by Psalm 131. Complete and total commitment and contentment and hope in the Lord. And just resting there like a weaned child. That's a great picture. A great picture of the forgiven sinner. And just in general, of anyone whose life is rests in the Lord. So let's walk through this psalm together. The first couple verses, we have the cry of the soul for mercy. The psalm opens with this cry, and it rises from the depths. And it is emphatically stated up front, out of the depths I have cried to you, O Lord. Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. There is agonizing here. And to the godly, sin and guilt are like being cast in the depths of the sea. And just think about this for a moment. Is this how we view our sin and our guilt? Just think about this for a moment. You see, sometimes we look at the work of Christ on the cross, and we ought to, the atoning work of Christ on the cross. He paid the price for all of our sins, past, present, and future. So sometimes we think, well, we don't have to deal with our sin. But we do. Sometimes we think, well, I don't have to scrutinize my life at all. Yes, but I do. 1 John 1. If you say you have fellowship with Him and yet you continue to walk in darkness, you lie. And the truth is not in you. I better evaluate my life. If I keep walking in sin, then do I really have fellowship with Him? But the great statement comes, right? If you confess your sins, verse 9. Right? Based upon His what? His righteousness. He will forgive them. So this is where we find the psalmist. Face to face with the righteous standard of God, he finds himself in the depths. The metaphor of the depths indicates distance and alienation from God, and this is ultimately the result of sin. You are set apart from God. How many times does David cry out lamenting, God, how long will you turn your face from me? How long will you be distant from me, right? Because he knows that every time he sins, it brings separation. It still happens to us. Even as we live in light of the atoning work of Christ on the cross, whenever we sin in our life, it brings separation between ourselves and God. And it can't stay there. Otherwise, we stay in this relationship of distance. So the psalmist cries out from the depths, and I love this, out of the depths of guilt and despair, we can cry out to the Lord for mercy. But here's a thought though. But to cry out for mercy, we must feel something of the depths of our guilt. Just stop and think about this for a moment. We can cry out from the depths of our guilt and despair. We can cry out for God's mercy. But to do this, we need to have a sense of our guilt. C.S. Lewis says this, and I love this. He says, when a man is getting better, he understands more and more clearly the evil that is still in him. Look at the progression of Paul's life, right? I am the least of the apostles. I am the least of the saints. 1 Timothy, near the end of his life, I am the chief of sinners. The closer he drew to the Lord, the more he understood how holy God was, the more he understood how condemned he was. C.S. Lewis goes on to say, when a man is getting worse, he understands his own badness less and less. This is the frustration sometimes of those who do not even realize just how sinful they are. You know, And usually it's in relationship husbands and wives. You know, sometimes you get the wife will say, you know what, my husband, the way he treats me, and he'll tear into me, he'll lay into me, he'll abuse me verbally in ways that he wouldn't normally even treat a stranger. He'll do these things to me, then he'll wake up the next morning and it's as if it never even happened at all. It's so frustrating because you realize that person doesn't see how sinful they are. And there's nothing I can do to change that. The psalmist realizes how sinful he is, and therefore he cries out of the depths. But the great truth is, no matter how low we may be, we can always cry out fervently to the Lord, and he will hear us. And he is merciful. He is so merciful. But first, we need to realize we're sinners. In his dire situation, he calls to his covenant God, and whose sovereignty is life and death. He is not only Yahweh, he is Adonai. He is the sovereign one, and he calls out to him for mercy. He calls upon him to be attentive. Notice verse 2, let your ears be attentive to the voice of my supplications. Hear me and respond in your mercy. That unmerited, undeserved grace. I mean, that's the reality of our sinfulness. When we realize how sinful we are, we realize we don't deserve anything but God's condemnation. And yet we know that we can cry out and he will be merciful. Verses 3 and 4, then come the confession of sin and forgiveness. And the great truth is God is full of forgiveness. If you, Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? And the answer is no one. Verse 4, but there is forgiveness with you, that you may be feared. The mercy of the Lord is found in his forgiveness, and he is full of it. God's forgiveness, though, is an interesting statement in verse 4. God's forgiveness leads to fear, and without either of these, we are doomed. Without his forgiveness or without fear, we are doomed. He lays two of these things out. The first is this. Here's, if I can put the psalmist's words in my own words. If the Lord were to tally up all my sins and hold me accountable for them, I'm done. I'm done. I don't have one glimmer of hope. I am a condemned man. That is the fact. The other thought that is so amazing, because without then his forgiveness we are doomed, but also fear, because fear keeps us from going back again. And I love this statement because this isn't normally how we would think to follow up forgiveness. But there is forgiveness with you that you may be feared. And we would think that's an odd way to end this thought. Forgiveness, there should be openness and boldness and joy and happiness, not fear, not fear. But there should be fear. You fear God because you know that he had every reason to condemn you, but he did not. And it is his forgiveness then that should render us from being flippant in regards to our sin in the future. You see, I realize I'm a sinner and I don't deserve his forgiveness, but he has given his forgiveness. He has shown me mercy, and because of that, I should walk in fear. I don't want to sin again. I don't want to be, as Proverbs says, the dog that returns to his vomit. That's a vile picture, but that's what we do when we keep doing the same sin over and over and over and over and over again. That's why Proverbs begins with, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of... The book ends on the fear of the Lord, and it runs all the way through all of Proverbs. When we've truly experienced the true forgiveness of God, we don't want to go back to that place of depths anymore. I don't want that separation. I don't want the alienation. I don't want the guilt. I don't want the despair. I don't want to sin against God. The psalmist raises up to the Lord and he leaves it there in verses 5 and following. Here we have waiting for the Lord, and it is the waiting of the soul. There is great anticipation here. Notice how the psalmist piles up phrases. I wait. My soul does wait. I do hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than the watchmen wait for the morning, more than the watchmen wait for the morning. And these are in italics, these last few lines, but it's understood that they are to be presented there. The psalmist has made his request, he's received forgiveness, and now he is waiting. What is he waiting for? He's waiting for God himself. The forgiveness is already assured in verse 4. Now he's just waiting for God. Think about this for a moment. Forgiveness is not just a feeling. It's a fact we obtain by faith. That's why I love Romans 6. No, 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 follow path. No, 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 reckon. Reckon yourself as dead to sin and alive to God. Not feel. Not feel. Reckon. La cabeza. In the head, the mind. Know this fact. Let's take it further then. Sin always strains our fellowship and a sense of closeness with the Lord. There is that separation. He cries out of the depths. There is that alienation that comes as a result of sin. So the psalmist is waiting on God for his sense of his presence. He's waiting and hoping for intimacy with God that he formerly knew. Again, how many times did David cry out, how long will you turn your face from me, God? How long will there be distance from us? Right? How long will you abandon me? How long will you leave me alone? I need a sense of your presence. And you look at all those Psalms when he does that, he is lamenting in his sin. Sometimes when I am not sensitive over my own sin, I will go to Psalm 38. Psalm 38. Basically, the psalmist then is looking for God's assurance that he is his child. I'm waiting. I'm waiting for the presence of the Lord. What is the basis of our hope? We hope in the word of his promise. Notice in verse 5, I wait for the Lord, my soul does wait, and in his word do I hope. Another question the psalmist answers, how should we wait and hope? We should wait and hope expectantly and confidently. The repetition of the words that he lays out in this particular psalm and the phrases that he uses shows his deep sense of longing, dependence, and also the assurance. The assurance. If I confess my sins and render them up to God, he will be merciful because he is a God of love and redemption, just as much as he is a God of righteousness. There is confidence in his redemption that comes, verses 7 and 8. Notice with me. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is loving kindness, and with him is abundant redemption. And he will, not maybe, he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. I love this because not only is he looking towards his own, he's looking towards others. I give you this thought, experiencing God's forgiveness should make one desire that others would also experience his abundant redemption. Man, we can be greedy with our salvation, can't we? We delight in the forgiveness that we have in Christ. We delight in all the blessings that we have in Christ. And then we're stingy and we hold them to ourselves and not share them with other people. We can sit there and revel in the forgiveness and mercy and compassion of God and his graciousness to us in his Son. All the while someone could be sitting us on their way to hell and not do a thing or say a word about it. I mean, oftentimes we tend to take on that attitude, well, at least I'm not. Who cares if they are? Finally, the rest. O Lord, my heart is not proud, nor my eyes haughty. nor do I involve myself in great matters or in things too difficult for me. Surely I have composed and quieted my soul like a weaned child rests against his mother. My soul is like a weaned child within me. O Israel, hope in the Lord from this time forth and forever. Whatever the original situation was, we don't know. Whatever it was that brought about such pride and such self-competence and self-contentment, we don't know. But what we're called to is humility. And that is the testimony of this psalm, the humility and the rest that comes to one who has a relationship with God, who finds hope in the Lord. Whether the sinner or whether it's throughout the rest of our life and all of its courses, this is the place we need to find ourselves, at peace with the one above. Because in the end, there is no true rest if it's not in Him. Everything else, it's counterfeit. The world offers up all kinds of counterfeits. It offers up a counterfeit love. It offers up a counterfeit faith. It offers up a counterfeit hope. It offers up a counterfeit peace. It offers up counterfeit hope. The only place to find true rest, true peace, true contentment, true hope is in God. That's it. That's it. The psalmist is going to lay out three things: his attitude, his action, and then his final aim, to hope in the Lord from this time forth and forever. And that is my hope. We will call down the righteousness of God upon this land, but we will be ready to face it and know that our lives will be judged by that same standard, but ultimately we are looking for this state of rest in the bosom of our Father. Yes? And we look forward to that day when we will finally get that final rest with Him. Let's pray.